In the early 70s, a group of students at C.W. Baker High School in Baldwinsville, New York, set out to build a radio station that would create a unique broadcasting experience, not only for them, but for a multitude of generations to come. Nearly a half-century later, it's time to hear firsthand from those who went behind the mic, telling the stories of how this station changed their lives, both in the studio and beyond, as we celebrate 50 years of broadcasting excellence on WBXL 90.5 FM. This is The Buzz Goes Gold.
Hello, this is another episode of The Buzz Goes Gold, and I am very, very excited to have one of the founding members, the founding member of the station right here in the studio. This is the one and only Mark Humphrey, class of 1975 or 76, one of those two.
Well, it was 75. Good morning, Jordan. And I think it's great that you're doing this series of podcasts. I can give everybody the whole story of how the station came to be. Let's go back to maybe my freshman year at Baker High. That was 1971. And I had heard about high school radio. You know, I'd read stories about it. And I knew that Central Square had a station. It's no longer on the air, but it was.
You know, the funny thing about, I'm sorry to interrupt that. It's interesting because I went on to do WJPZ, more about that later. So it's interesting how I'll get to that later.
And when we get to that later, I'll tell you my involvement with WJPZ because I had something to do with that as well. But anyway,
Okay.
WCSQ was on 89.3 with a antenna right on top of Paul V. Moore High School in Central Square. 1,500 watts, pretty powerful for a high school station. I could pick them up at home, and they were only on in the afternoon. Part of the problem there, with so much power and the antenna just strapped onto the chimney of the school building, the radio signal got into the PA system. They couldn't broadcast during the school day because of interference. And
I find that interesting.
well, it was convenient to put the antenna right on the chimney, but I don't know if the FCC would allow that today because of the RF hazard that, you know, they've come up with rules in the meantime. But WCSQ only ran about 3 hours each afternoon on school days. They were off the air all summer. Back then, the FCC didn't have any minimum limit for educational FM. And their programming was a lot of international, programs that they would get from different countries. They did play some music. They were pretty restricted on what they could play. But I listened and I thought, it would be fun to have something like that in Baldwinsville.
Yes.
And then in 1971, there was a show on the air, maybe you've heard of it, called Room 222.
It's interesting. I just watched that episode last night in preparation for today.
Oh, the one that I posted the link.
Yes.
Well, I happened to watch that. I liked Room 222. It was, I was in high school at that time, and it was kind of interesting. And they got a radio station. So, but what happened a few months later, my father worked at General Electric at Electronics Park. He shared an office with another engineer named Clayt Roberts. And both my father and Clayt and a few other guys from GE were recruited to build an FM station in Syracuse, the one that's on 102.9 WMHR. That went on the air in 1969. Well, Clayt was the chief engineer. He did that on the side. And he was responsible for the FCC rule compliance. And every few months, the FCC would issue updates to the rules. And it was sometime around 71, 72 that they did a whole new edition of the rules. My father gave me the old rule book. I studied that. I looked at the section dealing with non-commercial educational FM, and I saw what would be required to apply for a construction permit and then build a station and get a license. And it didn't seem too difficult as long as we kept the power down at 10 watts. At the 10 watt level, there were a lot of requirements that we wouldn't have to comply with, things that would cost much more money. So I wrote I guess it was maybe a 4-page proposal to the school principal, who at the time was Mr. Coates, and had a meeting with him. And I said, this is something that Baker High should look into doing. And he said, good idea, but you need a faculty advisor. Okay, so I'm thinking, who would be a good advisor? There was a teacher at the high school who had come from Rochester, and we knew from his bio that he did a show on one of the stations in Rochester. He was in social studies. I forget his name, but I asked him, he declined. But I knew there was another teacher that I had met over at Durgee Junior High named Al Jenner. And Al did a weekend shift on WSEN, the former commercial station in Baldwinsville. And I knew that Al had a first-class FCC operator license. And that's something that would be important for, WBXL. So I went over to the high school, and I think this was in spring of 72, before summer vacation. I had never had Mr. Jenner as one of my teachers, but I knew who he was. I think he was the head of the science department at Durgee. And I asked him, would you be interested in helping us start a radio station over at the high school? And he said, well, I'm pretty busy. No, thanks. So I just kept thinking about the project over that summer. And I went back to him in the fall. And then he said, well, that may be interesting. I won't be able to spend a lot of time because I'm at the junior high. But if you guys can, manage the station, let's go ahead and do it. So he seemed somewhat interested at that point. So now the thing was, we had to go to the school board because it was really the school district that was going to hold the license.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. So now this was around 1973. The economy wasn't doing too well that year. And the school district had some budgetary problems. So they were very concerned about spending money. And I was kind of young and didn't understand a lot of things, but I thought, we could probably build the station for $500. Now we need a transmitter, we need an antenna, we need some audio equipment. I'm thinking a transmitter shouldn't be too hard to build. I just need to know how to design it. And I went over to WSEN and I made a copy of the schematic diagram for their exciter. The exciter in an FM transmitter is basically a 10 watt. Well, now they're up to maybe 50 watts, but it's like a small FM by itself, and the rest of the transmitter is simply an amplifier that gets up to whatever power you need. So I thought if I could copy that schematic for their exciter, I'd build one. And it required about 20 tubes. Back then, solid state stuff, well, it was on the market, but it was a little more expensive. And I figured, with some tubes, we'll get some old tubes and old transistors. I had a ham radio license at that point, and hams like to build things. So that was my idea for the transmitter. The antenna, we figured, well, that's a piece of metal. And back then, we had metal shop down on the lower level of the school. I think all that stuff's been farmed out to BOCES now.
Yes.
But back
I
then,
don't really know.
yeah. So back then we had, a wood shop, metal shop, electronic shop. So, we'll get dimensions for an antenna and make one out of copper pipe or whatever. And then audio equipment. Back then, there were these language labs in the high school.
Okay.
Remember, I don't know what they do today, but there was kind of a fad back in the 60s where they would equip a couple classrooms with tape recorders, and they'd wire all of the desks with a microphone headset. And the teacher would be able to listen to each student individually, how they were pronouncing the different words, and butt in over the tape and say, you need to do this different or whatever. So they had these language labs, which had fallen into disrepair. And at that point, the school was taking them out of service. So we asked, can we have the tape machines? Can we have the audio cable? Because there was a few hundred feet of this shielded twisted pair from the front of the classroom back to the desks. And of course, you need wire to build a radio station. So they gave us these language lab consoles, which had switching and whatever. And I thought maybe there's a way we could modify them for the radio station. So that was the plan. We went to the school board. They said, we'll give you $500 and good luck. But they liked the idea because it wasn't going to cost them very much money. So Al and I, we had this meeting and we were all excited. But then we have to apply to the FCC, and we actually have to come up with everything needed to get the station on the air. And this is where we got kind of lucky. We got kind of lucky, yeah. I was reading the Syracuse newspaper, the Herald Journal, one evening at home, and I saw a little article about a proposal to build a radio station over at Fayetteville Manlius. And then it said something about a transmitter being donated to them by Syracuse University. So I thought, well, here's another school in Onondaga County that wants a station. Maybe we should exchange ideas. And I found out that one of the guidance counselors who was at Baker High had previously worked over there at Fayetteville Manlius, and he had some connections. So we went over and met with them one morning, and they already had a little studio set up. They were doing, feeding the PA system, or, they weren't actually broadcasting, but they had built a little studio. And sure enough, in the storage room was this General Electric transmitter that had been donated by WAER at SU.
So this Baldwinsville radio station has an SU connection, which is interesting because after I graduated high school and did 2 years at OCC, I went to SU. So I'm already great that this Baldwinsville story for WBXL already has an SU and Orange connection.
Absolutely. And here's the interesting part of the story. They had been given this GE transmitter, which was in a big cabinet. It was about the size of a refrigerator, 250 watts. They were under the impression that it weighed 10,000 pounds and that there was no equipment in the school district that could move it. I guess SU had just dropped it off the truck, and they decided they weren't going to go for an FM license. And if we could get it out of there, we could have it in Baldwinsville. So I asked, did they give you the instruction manual? Yes. Okay. Can I take that with me. So I took the instruction book for this old GE transmitter, and I looked at the specifications, and it says weight, 890 pounds. Well, most of that weight is in the transformers. If you can take the transformers out, a few of us guys can pick this thing up, and we'll get it in a truck, and we'll take it, back to Baldwinsville. And then I got to thinking, 250 watts, well, that's going to be more expensive because of the way the FCC rules are written. We need to have modulation monitor, frequency monitor. We have to do annual audio measurements, and we have to have a higher grade of license and so forth. So all we really want is 10 watts. And it has an exciter that will do a few watts. And that's the only part of the transmitter that we really want to use, but we'll take the whole thing. And then we got back to Baker, and I started modifying it. And there is a black and white photo. I'll send you the link if you want to put this online.
Sure, yes.
It shows me getting into this transmitter, taking it apart. And this was in 1973. All we needed was the low voltage power supply, the control circuit, the FM exciter. But here's the catch. The old GE FM exciter had this very expensive tube called a phasotron. And if you Google that term, it's a phasotron. Phasitron, I think. You could hardly find these tubes anymore, and if you could find one, you'd pay a few $100s just for this tube. And I realized that was going to be an expensive thing. So turns out I had started building a replica of WSEN's exciter, and I realized what I had finished building was enough to transplant into this GE and substitute for the phasotron. And then I could keep the rest of the GE circuit, and it would accomplish what was necessary to get a signal, on 90.5. So I started working on that. Now, the GE exciter only did 3 watts, so I had to build a little amplifier to get it up to 10 watts. But I was able to scrounge some parts. And what do you know? Over at Elizabeth Street School, which is no longer a school, it's a church now, but the original Baldwinsville Academy on Elizabeth Street, that old building. In the back of that building, there was this cabinet we found from a GE transmitter. All the parts had been stripped out, but somebody had made an aluminum panel that was the exact right size for the amplifier that I had to build for 10 watts. So I grabbed that panel. They were going to get rid of this thing. I have no idea what it was doing there or, why it was there, but I took the panel and I took it home and I built an amplifier for 10 watts. Well, then we're thinking about the audio console. In 1973, SU opened Newhouse 2. And they built a new studio.
I know, I've heard this story before. I've heard this story before because it also has something to do with the way I've heard it, but I'll let you tell it.
I'll give you my take on it in a few minutes. So they had these brand new, really nice studios, all done up with Gates Harris consoles. And they had put their old GE console in storage that used to be at the previous studio, which they called the prefab. And in fact, they had 2 of these GE consoles. And the Fayetteville Manlius people told me about this, and they wanted one of them for their station, and we could have the other one. So we went down there one afternoon, and I think Mr. Jenner drove his van down there, and we we picked up this old GE console that was built in the late 40s. It didn't have a power supply. So I was able to scrounge and get these old General Electric power supplies. They had a surplus store in Liverpool when GE was kind of phasing things out at Electronics Park. They had this store where they would sell old parts and equipment, whatever. And I got these old power supplies, and we figured out how to make them work with the console. So now we had a console, and we had tape machines from the language lab, but we still needed the antenna and some coax cable, and it's some kind of an antenna support. Well, I found out there was a school bus driver over in North Syracuse who had a tower on his house for the school bus radio or something, and he would sell us this 30-foot tower for $95. So we gave him some money. It was just tall enough to support the antenna that we built in the metal shop. And we had a little money to buy cable at Lafayette Radio, which is no longer in business. But they were kind of like Radio Shack back then. And so we still needed furniture. There used to be a store at the Tri-County Mall, which of course is no longer a mall.
Yep, I've heard of that.
But it was called Family Bargain Center, FBC. They were a little chain. They had stores in Liverpool and, central New York. And they went bankrupt, and they had this big going out of business sale in 1974. And the way it worked, the first week it was 20% off, everything in the store. And then the next week it was 40% off. And then it was 60% off. So you had people coming in there, buying stuff cheap. And they finally get to the point where everything that could possibly be sold is gone, but there's still a few things left over. So we got a hold of the head guy at FBC. What they were doing, they would consolidate everything in Liverpool after they closed the outlying stores. We found out, in Liverpool, they had sold everything they could possibly sell. And if we went over there one afternoon, we could take anything that was left. And so we went over in Al Jenner's van. And it was funny because, what was left that we could use? We found this big tabletop that would be good for the studio. It was like walnut formica. There were these little speakers hanging on the wall in the back room for PA. We grabbed a few of those. They were nice. And then 45 RPM records. There were quite a few records that hadn't sold because they weren't really hits, but they were free. So we grabbed all these records. We figured, okay, whatever we don't play, we'll give away, like prizes for the radio station. And then the file cabinet. You got to have a place to keep the station logs, so we grabbed this file cabinet. I think there may have been some swivel chairs and things. And these glass shelves. The store, had a department where, I don't know if what they were selling, but they had these thick glass, clear glass shelves that were about 4 feet wide by maybe 2 feet, maybe a little less. We thought those would be nice for a studio window. They were thick glass. They would be pretty soundproof. So we grabbed those. And the space that we were assigned in the school district was up on the second floor on the right side of the auditorium. It was this
that's where it was when I was there.
Yep.
Obviously modernized.
But it was pretty crude when we first built it. And we didn't have any money. We had $500, So some of the students, their parents, worked in construction, and somebody brought in some old 2x4s that had been part of a concrete form. We we scrounged some old sheetrock, and we threw together these studios. One thing that we still didn't have were turntables. And of course, back then, most of the music was on vinyl.
Records, vinyl, yes.
So we were able to get the audiovisual department to loan us a couple of turntables. They weren't professional grade, but they were, they played music. So that's what it took to get the station started. And we went on the air. Oh, we had to go to the FCC. Well, that was the other step. I did the construction permit application, and we had to pick a frequency. And I tuned around. Back then, there weren't that many stations in Syracuse. I knew it had to be below 92 because that's the reserve band for non-com. And I thought 90.7 would be a pretty good frequency. It was 91.3 was on the air, WCNY FM. There was WRVO at SUNY Oswego. They were down at 89.9. 90.7 seemed pretty good. So that's what I specified on the form. We sent it into the FCC. We got a nice letter 2 weeks later from the head of what was, I guess they called it the Broadcast Bureau back then. And he said, sorry, but 90.7 is third adjacent to WCNY FM. However, 90.5 would be acceptable. Please amend your application. So that was a nice response. They were, I don't know if the FCC would be that helpful today, but we did an amendment and refiled. And I also had to provide details of the modification I had made to the GE transmitter. That slowed us down a little bit. It took about 3 or 4 months before they granted the construction permit in the summer of 1974. But we had the CP by the time school resumed that fall, and built the station. And we signed on January 29th, 1975, my senior year.
Thanks for clarifying the month and the actual day. I didn't know. I knew it was 1975, but nobody actually told me the exact month and day. So thanks for clarifying that to me and all the listeners.
And I will send you a link to the history cards. If you, FCC, what they used to do back then, they kept all of their data on, paper, typewritten cards before they converted to digital. But in the 80s, they scanned all those cards to microfilm. And fortunately, all that stuff has been preserved. So I can send you the link and you can find all the exact dates of,
Oh, okay.
So then we had to come up with call letters. And, everybody calls the town Beeville. Okay, let's call it WBVL. Well, it turns out there was a station in Barberville, Kentucky that had already taken that call sign.
How interesting.
So what should we do? One of my friends who I had met in Boy Scout Explorers, and I should tell you a little more. The General Electric had this Explorer post dealing with electronics. And I'd go over there with my dad Friday evenings, and they'd sit around and talk about electronics. I met a guy named Bill Kretschmer. He went to Liverpool. And he had been down with his family on vacation down in Richmond, Virginia. And there was a station called WRXL, XL 102. And he says, why don't you call it WBXL, XL 90.5? And I said, I kind of like that. It's only one letter different than WBVL. So we did a search and nobody else had that call sign. So that's what we chose. Then we thought it would tie in pretty well,
Where did the buzz explain about the buzz.
Well, the
on it.
buzz came along a few years later, and that just, of course, ties in with the bees, you know. But that was that's how they came up with the buzz, which is fine, you know. That ties right in. Um, so let's see. I should also credit some of my classmates who were deeply involved.
Yes, please do. Just to inform it wasn't just yourself. You worked as a team.
That's true. And I couldn't have done it without their help. And one of them was Dave Castle, who worked at SU, and I think he's retired. I haven't spoken with him in many years, but and Larry Ice, who is on Facebook, and I think he's a member of the Facebook group on WBXL.
Yep, he just also signed on last night to do another episode of this podcast. So
And Mark Turcott, who's a member of that group.
we have an episode with him coming up also.
And Jeff Peniston, I think he's a teacher. Maybe he's retired. You know, we're all getting old now. You know, but I apologize for forgetting some of the others. Claude Roloff was one of our DJs, and I'm sure other people will chime in. But we had some pretty enthusiastic people involved, and the station was on the air, you know, school days. Now, here's where I can discuss things that weren't quite legal. Now, the statute of limitations has run out, but back then there was supposed to be an operator on duty all the time the station was on the air who held at least a third-class radio telephone license with the broadcast endorsement. And I had one of those licenses from when I was 15 years old. And I upgraded to the first-class license about a week before the station went on the air.
Interesting.
Al had a first class, and a couple of our other students had a third class. But there were times during the day when there was nobody in the station itself that had the license. And
now, tell me, did that go away over the years? Because
yes, because of deregulation. Because the FCC realized that equipment had become so much more reliable that you really didn't need to have somebody babysitting it all the time, you know. So, and another one of our students who was in my class of 75 was George Hilton. Here's what's funny. He told me I think it was his grandfather, had been with the FCC. And his grandfather was coming to visit the family, and he'd like to give his grandfather a tour of WBXL. So that was the only time somebody from the FCC ever showed up. But I think his grandfather's name was also George Sterling.
Okay.
And if you do a search on Google, he was one of the very early members of the FCC. He was a very highly regarded radio engineer and operator, and did a lot in the early days. And so George gave his grandfather a tour, and if we didn't have to worry about anything because he had been retired for years. But there were some things there that, well, we didn't have any kind of audio processing for the first few months. So there was some overmodulation. But as we were able to raise money and get more support from the school.
I'm sorry, explain to those like me and people who are not familiar with the term overmodulation.
Okay, well, you can only run so much audio level before you get distortion. And with FM, if you run it too high, you can bleed over into the adjacent channel. And the receivers don't, they can't accept that much deviation of the FM signal. So there are FCC limits on how much you can legally run. but without anything to regulate it. If the DJ doesn't have levels set right on the board, you have a problem. And likewise, if the levels are set too low, nobody can hear, well, very few people can hear what you're playing. So that's why stations have processors in line to compensate for, and of course they can increase the apparent loudness and the density and so forth. We couldn't afford one in the beginning, so we just trusted everybody to watch the VU meter and make sure everything looks okay. And we didn't have any cart machines, and back then that was the main system you used to play.
Yeah, I've heard of the carts, not through VXL, but through through JPZ. I've heard of carts before. I know what
they were a big deal back in the 70s and even through the 80s and 90s. Now everything's on hard drive or some other form of digital storage. But we wanted a cart machine. And I found one for $250, used cart recorder. Some station in Virginia was selling it. We had enough cash to buy the cart machine and a few blank carts. And that's how we recorded the station ID and the promos. And I guess maybe we had a few music carts, but those were more expensive. They had to have, 3 or 4 minutes worth of tape. For records, a lot of students would bring in their own 45s in, not necessarily great condition. But we had a microphone, we had 2 turntables, we had a tape machine and an old GE console and a transmitter, enough to broadcast. But it was on the roof of the school, the antenna. Yes. They covered the village fine, but out in Lysander, if you went out, to the west, not too good. Out by Whiskey Hollow, not too good. In downtown Syracuse, if you had a really good radio, you might hear it. So I'm thinking, we need more height. We need a better site. So this is my senior year in high school. I'm about ready to graduate in a couple months, but instead of paying attention in class, I'm looking out the window and I'm looking over at that water tank over,
So there was a water, I didn't know there was a water tank back then.
Back on the east side of the village, there used to be an 80-foot tall tank that was built in the early 20th century for the Baldwinsville Water Department. And next to it was a shorter tank that was larger in diameter. But that hill stood up, about 150 feet above the rest of the village. And I thought, wouldn't that be a better place for the transmitter? So I started doing research. And I rode my bike up there. And there was a little concrete cinder block building. And there was an antenna mounted on the short tank. And we found out that belonged to the town of Lysander Highway Department. They had built this little, building for their base station. And they mounted their antenna on the tank so they could reach the whole town. So we went down to the town office and we said, we'd like to move WBXL up to, that hill. Can we put our transmitter in your building? And here's what's amazing. Today there'd be a big legal hassle. And
I could imagine, yes.
And they said, oh, yeah. You just, how big is it? Oh, it's like 2 by 2, 6 feet high, okay, just don't take up too much space. And okay, good. How do we get in? Oh, we'll give you a copy of the key. Okay, good. So no problem. So we were able to have access to the building, but we still need to mount the antenna. Well, that's the water department's problem. I wanted to go on the tall tank, of course. So we talked to the water department. And I think Al helped us with this. And can we put an antenna on the top of the 80-foot tank? They said, yeah, no problem. Okay. So now we had this new site, but we needed to get the audio from the school up to the hill.
That must have been a big engineering challenge.
Well, in those days, it wasn't too difficult because the telephone company would lease copper for a fee, a monthly fee. WSCN used to order these phone lines for doing remote broadcasts. And the cheapest line was what they just called non-equalized. It was just literally a copper pair from point A to point B going through the telephone central office with nothing else in line. So you basically feed in audio and then you get it out the other end, but it may not be very well equalized, and you've got to deal with it yourself. Because as you know, you get high frequency loss through a pair of wires as the longer you go. So I called New York Telephone, which was the predecessor of Verizon. And I said, how much would an equalized line cost to go from East Oneida Street up to this hill? And they quoted, I think, $17 a month plus installation. And back then, the phone companies were very well regulated. You had all these tariffs. But in our case, it would involve running cable all the way from Route 31 up the driveway to this tank. And I think we just paid a flat rate. It wasn't that expensive. So I figured it's going to sound pretty good because it's not that much line. The central office is down on Elizabeth Street. And so it's going to basically be from the school to Elizabeth Street, then up the hill. I'll build my own equalizer. I can get a circuit for that. So that's how we got the audio to the new site. Now, the new site didn't happen until the following year. And I had started college in Western New York, but during summer break, I came home and I worked very closely with Al on this whole thing. I had a summer job over at Channel 9, which was that's why I'm glad I got my first class license, because back in the 70s, you needed first class to operate a television transmitter. And they had an opening for summer vacation relief. It was a union shop, and the engineers all had part of their contract. They'd get 2 or 3 weeks of vacation, and they needed another engineer to help fill in these shifts during the summer. And it was a great opportunity for me. And in fact, somebody had told me that there was an opening at Channel 5, and that was the first station I called, when I got out of school that spring for summer vacation. I called 5. They said, we filled the position. I called Channel 3. We don't have an opening. So then I get down the list to Channel 9, which back in those days was the 3rd rated TV station in Syracuse. And they said, yeah, we do have an opening. And I said, oh, great. Can I come in for an interview? I had 0 television experience. I had worked in radio, but no TV. But I had the license. And Mort Miller, who was the assistant chief engineer over at Channel 9, said he would give me 2 weeks to learn the job. And if I didn't work out, I'd have to, do something else. But I had the first class license, and he understood that I was in broadcasting. He gave me this opportunity. And so I trained under the projectionist, who was a man named Jim Larry. Learned how to do 16 millimeter projection and slides. That's what they still used in 1976. Videotape. They had 3 of these 2-inch quad VTRs in the master control, and shading cameras. And they let me go up to the transmitter in Pompey, up on Sevier Road, and see what that was all about. And it turns out it was a nice job. I got paid the starting wage under the union contract, but I was exempt from paying dues because I was a temp worker. And I worked there all summer, at least 40 hours a week, got overtime. That helped pay a lot of my tuition. And I did that for 2 more years. But during the summer, during my spare time, I worked with Al, and we were able to get the station's transmitter moved up to the hill. And then the coverage got much better. It was still 10 watts, but it was up higher. And I got some tubes from Channel 9 that they didn't need anymore, and I built an audio processor that was based on what was called the Gates stay level, which if you go on Google and you search for the value of stay levels, it's spelled STA-level. Some recording studios will pay a few $1,000s for the vintage Gates stay level. So I had the parts to build one, and that provided the audio processing. And so, it all kind of came together over the years. And then my family moved to Connecticut in 1978. I graduated from college. I had a job in the Finger Lakes for a few months, which was great experience, but it didn't pay too well. And I found out that SU had an opening, chief engineer at WAER. This was in December of 1979. I applied for the job and I was hired, and I started there in January of 1980, working under audio services. So about 50% of my responsibility was taking care of WAER, and it was in Newhouse 2 at that time, up on I guess it was the 4th floor. And then the other half of my job was maintaining audio facilities in the academic program at SU. And then you asked about WJPZ.
Yes,
of course. They had started out in this old building that was next to Newhouse 2.
Yep, with the Shine Student Center. From what I heard from Dr. Rick Wright, who was essentially SU's version of Al, he was JPZ's Al Jenner, essentially.
Yep.
From what I heard him say, the Spectrum record was a Spectrum Records, where the Sheraton and the Shine is now.
Exactly. And they had started this unlicensed AM station with the studio up in the attic. And they had this little RCA console that they got from WAER's old studio.
So that's very interesting how WAER, it's interesting how how that station helped launch the 2 other stations that, or at least I was part of, and the one station that you were part of. So that's very interesting how WAER helped put BXL and JPZ on the air.
WAER had a huge impact on broadcasting. It was actually the first 10-watt educational FM station in the country, which kind of an experiment sponsored by General Electric back in the late 40s. And the idea was an educational institution could start on FM, on a tight budget, and grow the station into something bigger, which is exactly what happened with WAER. Now, I should mention JPZ was originally on 1200 kilohertz.
Yep, I know that. I am aware of that.
And it was not exactly in full compliance with FCC Part 15.
Nope, I've heard this story also.
I could pick it up in Baldwinsville on a really good receiver. It covered downtown Syracuse quite well, but you needed, something a little more sophisticated to get it 10 miles away. But I could get a weak signal, and I knew that 100 milliwatts into a 10-foot antenna wasn't going to really make it that far. But there were some tricks involved, and I think most people know the story. And there's a very successful broadcaster who owns some stations in Syracuse today.
Yep, Craig Fox.
And I've known Craig for years, and so he had a lot to do with JPZ in the early days,
along with Bill Bliley, and who was the other one? Dave Roberts.
And then Eric Fitch was a student at SU when I was working there. Now, officially speaking, my manager didn't really want me helping WJPZ, but I was sympathetic, and I'd help them, on the side. I didn't do it on my regular time working, but they no longer had a good signal on AM, and I said, there is a frequency you could have on FM that's still available in Syracuse for about 100 watts. And in fact, I had gone over to Lemoyne and I said, I could get you an FM frequency. Are you interested? They declined. So I pitched WJPZ. And, I knew Rick Wright. He had been on the search committee when I applied for the job there. So I, talked to Rick about it. Rick was working, part-time as chief engineer at WOLF back then.
Yep.
So 89.1 would fit on Day Hall, but it had to protect Central Square on 89.3. And it turns out that if you just put the antenna on the roof, kept it below the elevation of WAER's antenna, you could do 100 watts non-directional, and 100 watts was the minimum power allowed for a Class A FM. So I had left SU. I left there in November 1981. I got lured into commercial radio again, and I moved to Rochester. I was the chief engineer of WVOR 100.5.
Okay, speaking of Rochester, there's a great station that I've discovered. Are you familiar with 103.9 WDKX and all?
Of course.
That's my favorite station. That's my favorite station whenever I visit Rochester.
Well, and I know the owner, Andre. WDKX, that's a subject maybe for another podcast. But they went on the air in the early 70s, and I should mention something else. When I graduated from Baker High in 1975, two of my friends, Larry Ice and Bill Kretschmer, and we really were interested in Rochester radio. Rochester was a bigger market than Syracuse.
Of course.
We thought the stations were better, and we wanted to go out and visit, but I didn't have a car, and neither did Larry or Bill. So let's ride our bicycles. So we left. This was maybe a week or so after graduation in June of 75. We left at like 5 in the morning and went out 370 to Route 104. And Larry's cousins lived in Ontario, New York, and we were able to stay at their place. We took this bike trip. And the next morning, we drove. We didn't drive. We rode. we pedaled into downtown Rochester, and we started visiting stations. And we hit WAXC, which was doing top 40 on 1460. It's now WHIC. It's a Catholic format, but back then they were in this top 40 battle with WBBF 950. And then there was WHAM, which of course is still on, but they used to be on East Avenue, WHFM, 98.9, which was my favorite Rochester station. One of my.
It's quite interesting because now that the call letter, I don't know if the call letters, they're obviously different, but the name of that station on 98.9 FM is called The Buzz.
That's correct. At the time, WHFM, I think the PD was Al Peterson. He had a good voice. We asked Al, would he do station IDs for WBXL, and he did this free of charge, just so we had a more, for imaging reasons.
I don't mean to cut you short, but we're already going on an hour.
Yeah,
and I just want to cover. You've mentioned his name several times over this episode, and we have to get to it because he, as of this recording, we're recording this on March 24th, so it's the day after Mr. Al Jenner unfortunately passed away. So please, any words on him and this news?
I was heartbroken. I got the news yesterday from his wife, who texted me, and it's so sad because we all hoped he could be there in January when the station celebrates 50 years on the air. I had fortunately had a meeting with Al a couple years ago we went out to breakfast at the Beeville Diner. It was great to catch up with him. We had kept in touch over the years. In fact, I helped him when they put in the microwave link from the school up to the hill to the transmitter. I helped with that.
The microwave. So explain a little bit briefly.
Well, the problem was Al called me. He had retired from teaching, but he told me the school was thinking of getting rid of the station because they were paying something like $300 or $400 a month to Verizon for these phone lines, because over the years they had switched to stereo and they went with the equalized phone lines, and those were getting very expensive. And so he wondered if there's a way I could come up with a less expensive system for feeding audio. And yes, you could get an unlicensed IP link and codecs and do it all over the air without a license. And it would pay for itself in maybe 2 or 3 months of savings if you got rid of the phone lines. So as a pro bono thing, this was maybe 13 years ago, I forget. But I helped them design it and set it up. And the school got a cherry picker truck so I could get up on the pole. They took down the water tank years ago. So, the antenna's on a wooden pole now that was part of one of the first cellular systems in that area. I mean, that whole hill is full of antennas now because it's a very good site for northwestern Chicago. So anyway, Al, he took me over to his house. He had been working on this big history project, and we need to finish that because he wanted to document the whole story of WBXL.
Okay.
He saved all of these pictures and newspaper clippings and stuff I had even forgotten about. And so that's a project that we all ought to try to finish up. It's probably almost finished. I have a feeling he was thinking of waiting until the 50th year and then presenting it. But we could put that online.
Oh, yes, definitely. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I wouldn't have known because the reason why I did this podcast, I wanted a way to celebrate the 50th anniversary by getting all the alumni together. Would you not be opposed to some sort of in-person reunion next year?
Of course. I plan to attend Al's memorial service on Friday of this week. But I'd be happy to come back in January because it's a big deal. The fact that WBXL has outlasted WSEN AM, and of course the original WSEN FM is now WOLF FM since Craig took
Yes.
over, and he moved the transmitter over to WFBL AM site in Clay. And the WSEN call sign he saved, that's on 103.9 up in Mexico for the Dinosaur, which I like the Dinosaur. When I'm up in central New York, that's usually when I'm not listening to BXL, of course. But anyway, that's the story. Al, without Al, we wouldn't have had a station.
I would agree. Now, I was obviously too young to have Mr. Jenner as a teacher. I remember I graduated in 2007, so I came in 2004. But I've heard stories. I've heard stories from older BXL alumni who've had great, nothing but great things to say about him. So
well, he took the station to the next level. We started it, like I say, on a very tight budget. It was in mono. It was only 10 watts. We had all this old equipment. Back at that age, I envied schools that had bigger budgets. Looking back on it, though, that's how I learned how to troubleshoot. And I learned a lot of skills on how to make do that paid off later in my career. But anyway, Al was able to convince the school district to invest in the station and raise the power and buy, Go Stereo and move across the hall to what used to be the teacher's lounge where there was more space. And
now it's in the library.
That's what I've heard. I haven't seen the library, but I'll be there hopefully in January and see what they've done. But he made it into a very impressive training program, and a lot of students, got careers either in broadcasting or some tech field as a result of WBXL, which
I'm hoping to hear in later episodes of this podcast. Again, we already have guests from the 70s, 80s, early 90s. I'm trying on my end to get more of WBXLers who were there during my time, because I really want the broad spectrum of the story to be told. It's great to hear early stories about the early years in the 80s, but I think it's important that we get the whole story told, and the only way to do that is to try to bring in people who were there during the later years as well, because during my time, for example, during the mid 2000s, I also felt like there were great stories to be told. One thing that I did that I want to point to your attention, hopefully that'll make you proud, I don't know, but I stuck with the community service broadcasting aspect of it. I actually went out of the way and I brought in members from the outside community, the Baldwinsville community, brought them into the studio and interviewed them about what was going on in the community. And because of that, not only did I get 2 awards thanks to my efforts, the station was able to keep its FCC license in 2006 when they renewed it, because of the community service broadcasting that I contributed to the station.
Absolutely. That was very important. And I was concerned because I knew that the station was deficient previously on the issues and program list, which is a requirement, for Class A FM. And so I wondered if they would lose their license or at least turn it in or get fined. But fortunately, things appear to be much better managed since then. And of course, it's easy for the FCC to find out if you're not compliant now that the public inspection file is online. I happen to be co-owner of a commercial station that's between Buffalo and Rochester. So it's my responsibility every quarter to make sure all that stuff is uploaded, because they'll come after you now. It's very easy.
Yeah, do you happen to know what that is? Are you willing to share?
My station?
Yes.
It's WCJW in Warsaw, New York, which is Wyoming County. We're about halfway between Rochester and Buffalo. The AM station is strictly daytime, 8,000 watts, but we're off at sunset and back on at sunrise, which is a problem in the winter if you're trying to do weather reports. Because in January, the sun doesn't come up till 7:30 or so. Fortunately, the FCC, after many years, allowed AM stations to have FM translators, which are typically, 250 watts. We were able to acquire the translators back in, 12, 13 years ago, and we have 6 of them. They're not real powerful, so you need more than one to really cover the entire area. But the station has been very successful as an independent, locally oriented station serving Wyoming County, Genesee County, which is Batavia, and Livingston County. That's what we focus on. The AM gets into Rochester quite well, but there's so many stations in Rochester, that's not our focus. You can also hear it on the east side of Buffalo pretty well, but we just basically concentrate on, the area in between, very agricultural, dairy farms, small industry.
Okay.
And my business partner, we went to college together. His name's Lloyd Lane. He manages the station, and he has the majority of ownership. And I came on board about 15 years ago after I went back to freelancing. As you may know, I lived near Philadelphia. I moved to this area in 1984. I worked at Temple University for 8 years at their public station, WRTI. And then I got back into commercial radio and spent 12 years at what was kind of the big alternative rock station in the market. But I decided in 2005 that I could go back to working for myself. And that's what I still do. So.
Okay.
Me.
So that's quite interesting. As far as, you can do a lot of things today. You don't have to rely on just terrestrial FM, AM. My point being is you can learn a lot of skills like I have that you can do what I've done, which is actually hand code a web page and turn it into a radio station.
Right. And when I worked for Y100, WPLY in Philadelphia, and it was around 1993, 94, when we were approached by a local guy who had a small ISP. And he said, you ought to get a website. And, we're talking 30 years ago. So I learned how to write HTML on a text editor. I got a copy of Mosaic, if you remember that browser.
Yes, I wasn't alive to use it, or I was probably too young to use it.
Well, he said, go to the bookstore, you can buy something called Internet in a Box. And you get Mosaic on a floppy disk. And I bought this book, How to Write HTML, how to learn HTML in 1 week or something. And it was very crude. But then, as you will know, Mark Cuban came up with, it was originally AudioNet to do streaming audio, real audio. And it was not the greatest quality. We were still using 28.8 dial-up modems back then. But I read a story about this. You could download something called Real Audio Player, and they were sending radio over the internet. We had one machine in our station with a sound card. So I installed Real Audio Player, and I went online, and it was only something like 15K mono. It sounded horrible, but it was audio. And I ran down, I grabbed my general manager and brought her upstairs. And I said, Lynn, this is like the Wright brothers' first plane. It's proof of concept. It sounds pretty bad, but you just wait. It's going to change everything. And of course, we wanted to start streaming. But back then, a real audio license for streaming was pretty expensive. We made a deal with another ISP, and we were able to upgrade to a T1 in exchange for letting him put 56K modems in our equipment room downstairs. He gave us full-time access to whatever bandwidth was left on the T1 back to his place. And he set us up with a six stream license, which is the minimum you could get with real audio, just so that we could be the first in Philadelphia to stream. And so, yeah, we were the first station in Philly to have a local radio website. Maybe I should have just gotten out of radio and just done internet, and I'd be rich, but I'm having more fun.
If you take a look at the private chat, I put the link to my station in the private chat.
I see that.
It uses YouTube. It essentially uses YouTube for the streaming, both on the music side and the live. So I would come on and actually do a live stream like we're doing right now, in between the YouTube videos, which play in a playlist. Essentially.
Okay, I will check that out. Anything else we want to discuss? Or?
I think we've covered it. One last thing.
Yeah.
And what is your impression of where the station is today? This is my final question before we wrap up. Looking back at all these years, what's your overall impression about where the station is today, and in terms of Beeville pride? No pun intended.
I think it's looking pretty positive because, again, WSCN is no longer. So it's the Baldwinsville station. And from what I see online, I think things look pretty good. It's the more they can integrate the station into the academic program, and this is what and maybe you picked up on this when you were a student, but I said, to satisfy the FCC on the community service, the issues programming, that can be part of courses, social studies or, whatever, and integrate it and the students get real experience. I mean, it's not just, theoretical stuff. They're actually going out and talking to people and putting it on the air so the public can listen.
Yeah, just like that episode of the Room 222.
Exactly. Of course, politics, but
any advice for the current or the younger generation in general? That could be students. Yeah. That could be anybody like me or younger.
Well, just take advantage of these opportunities at an early age, when you're in high school. It gave me a great head start on my career. The fact that I could, work in, actually hands-on experience in broadcasting when I was 16, 17 years old, and get a license. The licenses are no longer needed, but that was my foot in the door for my summer job, which, like I say, it paid well. Now I thought radio would be more interesting than television. So even though I could have stayed at Channel 9, I guess, I decided to pursue radio instead. But if I went in a TV station today, it would be unfamiliar. No more videotape, no more.
I mean, technology has changed since then.
Dramatically. But I've enjoyed radio and still try to have fun. Not every day is fun, of course, but I think it's still a great medium. It's expanding, of course, into streaming. It's all about content delivery and what's most convenient for the listener. But I think, local radio has a kind of an important niche that satellite and these big national networks can't deliver.
I say this because we're living in an age where local hosts are slowly being replaced by nationally syndicated programming. It's quite interesting. We had Mark Turcotte on just on Friday, and I was blown away when he told me that he was part of the team that was responsible for getting Ted and Amy on the air over at 93Q.
Yeah, well, this I didn't know Ted, but there are, Mark has done very well. I'm proud of him. He learned a lot that paid off, and he's had some pretty impressive jobs down south. And I saw him, by the way, it's about 7 years ago. There was a radio convention. The NAB had the radio convention in Nashville. And I drove down for that, and he was there. So I was able to chat with him a little bit. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up. But before I do, I want to thank you, not just from the bottom of my heart, but from all the WBXL alumni who has been great enough to walk through those doors and be a part of the vision and the mission, the unique opportunity that you, Al, and your team created. So once again, I want to give a big thank you on behalf of everyone else involved with this great station. You created something that was unique and continues to serve the Baldwinsville community for years to come. So thank you very much for being on the podcast, and go Bees.
And thanks for inviting me, George.
Thanks again for listening to The Buzz Goes Gold, a podcast celebrating 50 years of broadcasting excellence on WBXL 90.5 FM. This podcast is produced exclusively by the alumni of WBXL, with hosting duties by yours truly, Jordan Hayes, class of 07, and the intro voiced by Rick DiUlio. Many special thanks go out to WJPZ alumnus John Jag Gay, class of 2002, for the inspiration behind this podcast and his helpful tips and advice for making it go.